Hi everybody, welcome back to another episode of ATP, Ask the Pastor. Today we've got another question about Bible translations. Dear Pastor, I know you have addressed translations of the Bible a couple times, but I've not heard you address the ESV. The Lutheran Church Missouri Synod has adopted the ESV as the official text and used it throughout the current service book and catechism. What's your view on the ESV? Also, do you know much about the WEB, the World English Bible, and would you recommend it? Sure, so the first thing that we look at whenever we look at Bible translations is the Greek texts that are being used for the translation of the New Testament. Now, I posted a video before about why I prefer the KJV and the New King James due to the fact that both of those used what's called the textus receptus, or the received text. I like the received text for its use, especially here in the last couple hundred years then. Now, the ESV, on the other hand, the English Standard Version, is not based on the textus receptus. It's based on a plurality of texts. It's based on what we call the critical text, or what I like to call the eclectic text. It's based on a whole bunch of different manuscripts. Most of them are thought to be the oldest manuscripts that we have. The problem with those texts, especially the two main ones that the critical text uses, is that those two texts don't always agree with one another. The critical text also uses papyri that are believed to be very old but have little to no attestation in the future, meaning that even though they're old, there aren't any other readings that match those readings, or there are very, very few, meaning those texts weren't copied that often, if at all then. What this means is that the Greek of the ESV, the Greek of the eclectic text that's behind pretty much all modern translations, but not every single one of them, it is a Greek text that's never existed in the history of the church before. Now, one good thing that ESV does have going for it is its commitment to the translation philosophy of formal equivalency, which is a fancy way of saying that it's a word-for-word translation more so than a thought-for-thought translation. Formal equivalency is always superior to any sort of translation done with the philosophy of dynamic equivalency. And you can check out our video on the modern English version, the MEV, to hear a little bit more discussion about formal versus dynamic equivalency. So textually, I don't care for the ESV, but I do appreciate its commitment to formal equivalency. Now, there is, however, one aspect of the translation specifically which concerns me enough to not recommend the ESV. In several spots, the ESV, the translation into the English, can lead to Christological problems dealing with who Christ is specifically. The first of these issues, I want to just cover two of them. The first of these issues is the ESV's translation of the Greek word monogenes in places like John 1:14, John 1:18, John 3:16, John 3:18, and 1 John 4:9. The ESV translates monogenes as only rather than only begotten, as the older translations did. Now, does this translation mean that the translation committee of the ESV rejects the eternal generation of God the Son? Not necessarily. But it does, but rather it is troublesome than the clear word, monogenes, which has a long theological history and a long history in the church, especially as it's been used to defend the divinity of Christ. It concerns me that this has been changed to a more ambiguous translation of only, or in some places, one and only. Now, in today's climate, where there's all sorts of confusion already about Christ being the only begotten Son of God, begotten from the Father before all eternity, or from all eternity, this is, I think, is an unfortunate translation of the word. Imagine if an entire generation of Christians grew up knowing Jesus as the only Son of the Father rather than the only begotten Son of the Father. That opens the door for a resurgence of Arianism from the 4th and 5th and 6th centuries then, at least in my opinion. Now, I'm not saying that the translation committee is full of a bunch of Arians. Don't hear what I'm not saying here. What I'm saying is that there are implications of this ambiguity, especially for the future, and I think that ambiguity is one that's dangerous. It doesn't serve the church, nor, I think, does it reflect upon the word monogenes or upon the analogy of faith that we see all throughout the Scriptures then. Now, another passage that's translated in a problematic way that deals with Christology is found in Philippians 2, verse 6. The ESV reads, Christ was in the form of God, rather than being in the form of God. Now, this may seem like a small difference here, but the Greek verb in Philippians 2, verse 6 is a present tense, not a past tense. And by translating the verb, the participle there, in the past tense, it could be argued that in the incarnation, Christ surrendered his deity for a time by becoming man. Now, it could just be that the translators used the past tense since, from Paul's perspective, the incarnation was a past event. But I think textually there's really no good reason for that change. In this instance, the ESV drops the ball on their promise to be as word for word as possible. And in the process, again, it opens the door for heretical views regarding Christ. The present tense, I think in my opinion, textually shows that Christ exists in the form of God before and during the incarnation. So that's the ESV. Now, as far as the World English Bible, the WEB, is concerned, this translation intrigues me. The WEB is a revision of the 1901 American Standard Version, but it's more than just a revision. It was edited to conform to the majority text that was published in 1982. Now, the majority text is what I like to call a statistical text because its readings reflect the majority of Greek manuscripts that we have. The majority of our extant Greek manuscripts are from the 10th and the 11th century, so the 9th and 10th, 900s and 1000s. And they show an incredible amount of uniformity. The majority text only differs with the received text, the one behind KJV and New King James, by around or just under less than 1% of the time, whereas the eclectic text, the critical text, differs from the Textus Receptus a little over 2% of the time. So in one way, the majority text is on the opposite end of the spectrum as the critical or eclectic text. The eclectic text weighs as most important the oldest manuscripts, even if they have no future attestation, whereas the majority text weighs the number or the plurality of text as most important. I tend more towards the majority text than the eclectic text because I assume that the church throughout the ages would have copied good texts rather than bad texts, since those are the texts that would have been used for services in lectionaries, etc. then. So textually, the WEB intrigues me. Now, to the best of my knowledge, the WEB is also only one of two English translations to use the majority text. It employs formal equivalency over dynamic equivalency, so it's got more of a word-for-word than a thought-for-thought translation. I also like the fact that it's in the public domain. However, before recommending it wholesale to folks, I want to spend more time with it just to see how the editors balance their commitment to formal equivalency with their desire to have the Bible, as they say in the frequently asked questions, to normal modern English. So like I said, the biggest thing I think it has going for it is really a English translation from the majority text. What intrigues me most is the textual aspect of it, and not necessarily a translation aspect of it. Now, all that being said, I do have the same concern for the WEB that I mentioned just a moment ago for the ESV when it comes to the translation of monogenes as one and only rather than only begotten in John 1:14, 1:18, 3:16, 3:18, and 1 John 4, verse 9. As with the ESV, in this instance, I don't care for the ambiguity whatsoever. I think there's no reason to introduce that sort of ambiguity into such an important topic and in such a clear portion of the Scriptures then. The WEB, however, does translate the participle in Philippians 2, verse 6 as a present, unlike the ESV then. Now, overall, my verdict is I'm going to stick with my New King James, but I will be keeping an eye on the World English Bible, if for no other reason than just to see how the church receives a New Testament that's translated from the majority text then. So, thanks for the questions. If you're still interested in more about Bible translation, make sure and check out ATP's playlist. Also, don't forget to subscribe to Ask the Pastor, and make sure and hit that notification bell. That way you don't miss any of our future episodes as they drop for Ask the Pastor. Thanks a lot for watching. We'll see you next time.